What did you put in that coffee? That wasn't supposed to be your cup. The words tumbled from Michael's trembling lips as my sister-in-law collapsed onto the dining room floor. Her face contorted in pain, a mix of betrayal and terror in her eyes as she looked up at her beloved brother, my husband of 3 years, who had just accidentally revealed his true intentions by a twist of fate that switched our fates in a single sip. My name is Olivia, and at 34, I never imagined I'd be witnessing my own husband admitting to an attempted murder plot at our monthly family brunch. But after years of mysterious illnesses and suspicious accidents, I had finally caught them in their own trap. The question was no longer whether they were trying to kill me, but why they had been so desperate to do so. 30 minutes earlier, I had been sitting at Victoria's elegant dining table, staring at a coffee cup with an oddly metallic smell. Michael had placed it before me with an unsettling smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I made this specially for you, darling," he had said, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "A new brewing method I've been perfecting." That word, perfecting, sent chills down my spine. How many times had they perfected their attempts on my life? The unexplained stomach pains, the dizzy spells that always seemed to strike before important client meetings, the accidental of food poisoning that had landed me in the emergency room 3 times in the past year. Victoria watched me intently from across the table, absently stirring her own untouched coffee. "Michael has become quite the expert lately," she said with a smirk. "He's been practicing different methods just for you." The way she emphasized "for you" confirmed what I had long suspected. This wasn't just about sibling rivalry anymore. I had noticed Michael spending more time at Victoria's house lately, claiming they were planning a surprise for our upcoming anniversary. But something felt off, the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room, the strange texts I'd glimpsed on his phone, and now this coffee with its peculiar scent. Looking at them now, I couldn't help but remember how it all began. 3 years ago, at a friend's wedding in the city, Michael had seemed like everything I'd been looking for. He was charming, attentive, and seemingly devoted to building a future together. Even Victoria had appeared welcoming at first, helping to plan our wedding and including me in family gatherings. But the signs were there from the beginning, if only I'd been willing to see them. The way Victoria's smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me. The subtle comments about my career success being lucky. The strange incidents that always seemed to happen when she was around, the spilled wine on my dress at important events, the mysteriously overseasoned food when she helped cook. 5 years before meeting Michael, I had watched my own family crumble when my father's business collapsed. He disappeared one night, leaving nothing but mounting debts and unanswered questions. That experience had taught me to trust my instincts, to recognize the subtle signs of impending disaster. Perhaps that's why I started keeping records of every accident, every unexplained illness, every strange coincidence. It started small, an upset stomach here, a mild allergic reaction there. Michael always had an excuse ready. Maybe it was something you ate earlier, or you must be coming down with something. But the pattern was becoming clear, especially when I noticed how these incidents always seemed to occur before important meetings or presentations. The worst was 2 months ago, when I ended up hospitalized after breakfast at their house. The doctors found traces of something they couldn't identify, but Michael convinced everyone I must have taken expired medication. That was when I started secretly recording our conversations and keeping a backup phone with a different number. Victoria's perfectly manicured hand trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup, the one I had switched with mine. Her face suddenly drained of color. "Michael," she said, her voice shaking. "Something's wrong." Michael looked up, his expression changing from confusion to horror as he realized which cup she was drinking from. He jumped up, knocking over his chair. "Nah." "What's happening?" Victoria's hands were trembling violently now. "I don't. I feel." She tried to stand but stumbled, grabbing the edge of the table for support. "What did you put in that coffee?" I stepped out of the study, my phone already recording. Michael was beside Victoria now, his face ashen. "That wasn't supposed to be your cup," he whispered, but in the silence of the dining room, his words carried clearly. Victoria's eyes widened with realization and fear. "Call an ambulance," she gasped, sliding to the floor. "Please, I can't." I dialed 911 immediately, my hands steady despite the chaos unfolding before me. Victoria was on the floor now, her body racked with violent tremors. Michael knelt beside her, panic written across his face as he realized their plan had backfired spectacularly. Emergency services? Yes, we need an ambulance at 1604, Maple Ridge Avenue, I said clearly, keeping my phone recording with my other hand. My sister-in-law appears to be having a severe reaction to something in her coffee. She's conscious but experiencing tremors. As I spoke to the dispatcher, Victoria's eyes locked onto mine. The usual cold calculation in her gaze was replaced by raw fear. Olivia, she gasped, you switched, you knew. Ma'am, the ambulance is on its way, the dispatcher assured me. Please stay on the line. Michael was growing more frantic by the second. Victoria, what's happening? That wasn't supposed to. I mean, it wasn't meant for. Shut up, Michael. Victoria snapped through gritted teeth, her anger momentarily overcoming her distress. This is all your fault. You said it would just make her sick enough to miss the board meeting next week. You promised it wouldn't be traced. My blood ran cold. The board meeting, where I was scheduled to present my proposal for a major client account. The same account Victoria had been trying to land for months at our competing firms. Everything started clicking into place. The tea last month, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. And the breakfast incident 2 months ago. Those weren't accidents, were they? Victoria's face contorted with another wave of pain. The tea, that was supposed to keep you home during the Johnson contract presentation. But you went anyway. She clutched her stomach, doubling over. Michael said, he said we just needed to discredit you, make clients think you were unreliable. The sound of sirens filled the air outside. Michael stood up, backing away from both of us. Victoria, stop talking. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying, Victoria spat, her words slurring slightly. We've been planning this for months, ever since Olivia started outperforming me at every client meeting. You were supposed to make sure she drank it today. The paramedics burst through the front door, and I quickly stepped aside to let them work. As they loaded Victoria onto a stretcher, I stopped recording and sent the video to my private email, then to my lawyer. Michael stood frozen, watching as his carefully constructed plan crumbled around him. I'll ride with her to the hospital, I told the paramedics, my voice firm. After all, I need to make sure my sister-in-law gets the proper treatment. I met Michael's terrified gaze. And I'm sure the doctors will be very interested in knowing exactly what was in that coffee. As the ambulance doors closed, I couldn't help but think about how different everything had turned out from what I'd imagined 3 years ago. But perhaps this was always where we were headed, the inevitable collision of ambition, jealousy, and twisted family loyalty. The only question now was how far they would fall, and whether I would finally get the answers I deserved. The emergency room at Metropolitan General Hospital was a flurry of activity as doctors rushed to treat Victoria. I sat in the waiting room, my phone clutched in my hand, replaying the recording of Victoria's confession. Dr. Matthews, a tall woman with graying hair and sharp eyes, approached me with purposeful strides. Mrs. Bennett? I'm the attending physician for your sister-in-law. She gestured for me to follow her to a more private area. We've found some concerning substances in her blood work. Could you tell me exactly what happened before she became ill? I took a deep breath and pulled out my phone. I think you should listen to this first. As the recording played, I watched the doctor's expression change from professional concern to alarm. Her eyes narrowed as she made notes on her tablet. This is very serious, she said, her voice low. The substance we found isn't something that accidentally ends up in coffee. We're looking at deliberate contamination with pharmaceutical-grade compounds. Just then, Michael appeared at the end of the hallway, his face pale and sweaty. He'd clearly overheard the doctor's words. Olivia, he started, taking a step toward me. Let me explain. Stay back, Dr. Matthews warned, pressing the nurse's call button. Security to room 412, please. Michael raised his hands in surrender. This is all a misunderstanding. Victoria was confused, she didn't know what she was saying. Really? I pulled up the texts I'd discovered on his phone last week, the ones I'd secretly forwarded to myself. So these messages between you and Victoria about making sure I'm out of commission before the Henderson presentation were just friendly conversation? His face drained of color. You went through my phone? After I found the strange files in your desk drawer? Yes, I did. I turned to Dr. Matthews. Doctor, I've been hospitalized 3 times in the past 6 months with unexplained symptoms. I'd like to know if they match what you found in Victoria's system today. Detective Martinez arrived within the hour, her presence commanding attention in the sterile hospital corridor. She was a seasoned investigator who specialized in cases of domestic abuse and attempted murder. Her dark eyes missed nothing as she reviewed the evidence I'd gathered. Tell me about the first incident, she said, her notebook ready. I pulled out my meticulously maintained documentation. February 15th, dinner at their house. Severe stomach pains and dizziness that lasted for 3 days. I missed the quarterly board meeting where I was supposed to present our new marketing strategy. And Victoria's company won that contract, Detective Martinez noted. The pattern became clearer with each incident. April 3rd, the tea incident. June 21st, the breakfast that sent me to the emergency room. Each time, something important was scheduled at work. The detective's eyes narrowed as she looked at my detailed log of dates, symptoms, and circumstances. And you've been recording conversations? I hesitated before pulling out another phone from my purse. I started carrying a backup phone after the second incident. I have several recordings where Victoria and Michael discuss their plans, though they're careful not to be explicit. I played one of the recordings. Victoria's voice came through clearly. The Henderson account is worth millions, Michael. We can't let her ruin everything we've worked for. Just stick to the plan. Michael's response was equally damning. I've got something stronger this time. She won't make it to the presentation. Through the window of Victoria's room, I could see my sister-in-law was now awake, looking significantly less confident than she had at brunch. The hospital was running toxicology screens, and Dr. Matthews had already identified several substances that don't occur naturally. A commotion down the hall caught our attention. Michael was arguing with the security guards, his voice rising in desperation. I need to speak with my wife. Olivia, please, you don't understand. We were trying to protect you. Detective Martinez stepped between us. Mr. Bennett, you're not helping your case. We've already found evidence of premeditation. Premeditation? Michael laughed, a hollow sound that echoed through the corridor. We were just trying to slow her down. She was working herself to death, taking all the major accounts. Victoria said if we could just make her take some time off. By poisoning her? Detective Martinez's voice was sharp. That's not protection, Mr. Bennett. That's attempted murder. The color drained from Michael's face. Murder? No, that's not. We never meant to. Then what exactly did you mean to do? I asked, my voice surprisingly calm. When you put something in my coffee this morning, what was supposed to happen? Michael's silence spoke volumes. Behind him, I could see Victoria watching through her hospital room window, her face a mask of fear and calculation. I wondered if she was trying to figure out how to spin this, how to explain away months of systematic poisoning as some sort of misguided attempt at helping me. As the afternoon wore on, more evidence came to light. The police found a collection of pharmaceutical compounds in Michael's office desk, along with detailed notes about dosages and reactions. The bottles bore labels from a research facility where Michael's college friend worked in the testing department. Victoria's hospital room became the center of a criminal investigation. Dr. Matthews entered with a tablet in hand, her expression grim as she reviewed the test results. Detective Martinez and I followed while Michael remained outside with the guards. The toxicology report shows elevated levels of several substances, Dr. Matthews announced, her voice clinical. Most concerning is the presence of a particular compound that's typically used in pharmaceutical testing. It's not something the general public should have access to. Victoria's face paled. That's impossible. Michael said it was just something to cause mild symptoms. Mild symptoms? Detective Martinez interrupted, taking out her notebook. Like the ones your sister-in-law experienced over the past 6 months? Another detective entered, holding an evidence bag. We found these in Mr. Bennett's office desk at Anderson Marketing, he reported, presenting several small bottles with clinical labels along with detailed notes about dosages and reactions. I felt my knees weaken as I realized the full scope of their plan. You were documenting everything, like some kind of experiment? It wasn't like that, Victoria protested, but her voice wavered. We just needed to track what worked. The first few attempts weren't effective enough, you kept showing up to meetings anyway. So you increased the dosages, Detective Martinez concluded, examining the bottles. Did you know these substances could be lethal in higher concentrations? The room fell silent. Michael, still visible through the window, sank into a chair in the hallway, his head in his hands. The Henderson account, I said slowly, pieces clicking into place. It wasn't just about that presentation, was it? You needed me out of the way permanently because the client specifically requested me as their lead. Victoria's face contorted with a mixture of anger and fear. You were ruining everything. I built that client portfolio for years, and then you show up, and suddenly everyone wants to work with you instead. Michael said he could fix it. By killing me? The words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. We weren't trying to. Victoria started, but Dr. Matthews cut her off. The concentration in the coffee you drank today, the doctor stated, looking directly at Victoria, was significantly higher than previous samples we've analyzed from Mrs. Bennett's earlier hospital visits. If she had consumed it, the outcome would have been severe, possibly fatal. Detective Martinez turned to the other officer. We'll need a full warrant for both their homes and offices. And contact the pharmaceutical company listed on these bottles, find out how they obtained these substances. Victoria slumped back against her pillows, the fight draining from her face. It wasn't supposed to go this far, she whispered. Michael kept saying we just needed one more try. I stepped closer to her bed, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. Every time I got sick, every meeting I missed, every client I lost, you were both there, watching, taking notes on how your poison was affecting me. What kind of people does that make you? The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, I could hear Michael being read his rights as additional officers arrived. Victoria stared at her hands, unable to meet my gaze. Detective, I said, turning away from my sister-in-law, I'm ready to make my formal statement now. As I followed Detective Martinez out of the room, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the window. I looked different somehow, stronger, more resolute. The woman staring back at me wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a survivor who had turned the tables on her would-be murderers, using their own carefully laid plans against them. The next few hours were a blur of statements and paperwork. The evidence mounted, the recordings, the text messages, the poisonous compounds, and their own damning confessions. What had started as a simple case of sibling rivalry had escalated into a calculated attempt on my life, all because I had dared to be more successful than they thought I should be. As night fell over the hospital, I sat alone in the waiting room, processing everything that had happened. The doctor had confirmed that Victoria would recover, a small mercy, considering what they had planned for me. Michael was in custody, and the pharmaceutical company was launching its own investigation into how their testing compounds had been obtained. My phone buzzed with a message from the Henderson client, confirming our meeting for next week. I smiled grimly at the irony. All of this, the poisoning, the plotting, the betrayal, and in the end, they had only succeeded in destroying themselves. The district attorney's office was eerily quiet as I sat across from Laura, the lead prosecutor assigned to my case. 3 weeks had passed since that fateful brunch, and the preliminary hearing was scheduled for tomorrow morning. Your documentation is extraordinary, Laura said, reviewing my files. Most victims don't think to keep such detailed records. The timestamps on your backup phone, the forwarded text messages, the recorded conversations, you've built us a solid foundation. I watched as she spread photographs across her desk, evidence collected from Michael's office and Victoria's home. They were meticulous too, I noted, looking at their detailed logs of my reactions. Just not careful enough. The pharmaceutical company's internal investigation has been particularly damning, Laura continued. Thomas, Michael's college friend in their testing department, has agreed to testify against them in exchange for a reduced sentence. He's provided documentation of every compound he smuggled out for them. The list of substances was frightening in its sophistication. What had started with relatively mild compounds had escalated to potentially lethal combinations. The prosecutors had traced a clear pattern of escalation, each failed attempt followed by something stronger, more dangerous. We've also subpoenaed records from both of your companies, Laura added. The timing of your illnesses correlates perfectly with major contract presentations and client meetings. Victoria's company mysteriously won several accounts immediately following your unexplained absences. I remembered each of those lost opportunities, the clients who had drifted away after I'd failed to appear at crucial meetings. The financial impact alone was staggering, millions in lost contracts, all orchestrated by my own family. The preliminary hearing the next morning was like watching a carefully choreographed dance fall apart. Victoria and Michael sat at separate tables, their lawyers having advised them to distance themselves from each other. The evidence mounted as each witness took the stand. Dr. Matthews presented her medical findings first, her testimony precise and devastating. The progression of compounds shows a clear intent to cause harm, she explained to the court. Each new substance was more potent than the last, with the final dose being potentially lethal. Thomas's testimony followed, his voice shaking as he detailed his role in the scheme. Michael said they just needed something to make his wife take a break from work, he recalled. But the quantities they requested kept increasing. When I questioned it, Victoria told me it was none of my business. The prosecution presented email exchanges between Michael and Victoria, discussing their plans in coded language that now seemed painfully obvious. The first treatment wasn't strong enough. She's still outperforming everyone. We need something more effective. The client meeting next week is crucial. Teak can get us something stronger. This time she won't recover so quickly. Detective Martinez took the stand next, methodically laying out the timeline of events. The defendants showed a clear pattern of escalation, she testified. What began as attempts to cause minor illness evolved into a sophisticated poisoning scheme with potentially lethal intent. The afternoon session brought Victoria's former assistant to the stand. Emily, a young woman who had recently left the company, clutched a stack of papers as she testified about conversations she had overheard. Ms. Anderson would get angry whenever Mrs. Bennett won a new client, Emily recalled. She would call her brother, complaining about how Olivia was stealing her business. The day before the Johnson contract presentation, I overheard her tell Mr. Bennett that they needed to take care of the problem permanently. Michael's lawyer attempted to paint their actions as misguided concern rather than malicious intent. My client was worried about his wife's workaholic tendencies, he argued. His actions, while admittedly misguided, were driven by concern for her well-being. The prosecutor's response was scathing. Concern doesn't involve carefully documented poisoning attempts. Concern doesn't escalate to potentially lethal doses. The defendants methodically planned and executed multiple attempts to harm Mrs. Bennett, all while documenting their efforts like scientists conducting a deadly experiment. Victoria's composure finally cracked during cross-examination. She was taking everything from me, she burst out, her carefully maintained facade crumbling. Every client, every account I'd spent years building, they all wanted her instead. Michael was supposed to fix it. By killing me? I asked quietly from my seat, loud enough for the courtroom to hear. The judge called for order as Victoria's outburst continued. We weren't trying to kill you, she insisted, but her voice wavered. We just needed you to fail, to stop being so perfect at everything. The prosecutor seized on her words. And when minor illnesses didn't cause enough failure, you escalated to potentially lethal compounds, didn't you, Ms. Anderson? Victoria's silence was damning. Michael took the stand last, his appearance disheveled, a sharp contrast to his usually polished image. Under questioning, he tried to maintain that they had never intended to cause serious harm. The final dose, the prosecutor pressed, was significantly stronger than previous attempts. Can you explain why you increased the concentration to potentially lethal levels? Michael's response was barely audible. Victoria said we needed something definitive. The Henderson account, it would have made her career. And ended Mrs. Bennett's life, the prosecutor added coldly. The evidence kept mounting. Financial records showed substantial bonuses Victoria had received after winning contracts I had mysteriously missed. Security footage from their office showed Michael and Victoria meeting late at night, examining documents that were now confirmed to be their poisoning logs. During closing arguments, Laura addressed the jury with quiet intensity. The defendants would have you believe this was about protecting Mrs. Bennett from overwork. The evidence tells a different story. This was a calculated campaign of escalating poison attempts, driven by professional jealousy and culminating in a dose that could have been fatal. As the jury left to deliberate, I sat in the courthouse corridor, thinking about the past 3 years. Every shared meal, every family gathering, every seemingly caring gesture, all of it had been tainted by their deadly intentions. The jury returned after just 4 hours. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman stood. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Michael Bennett, guilty. A pause, then, on the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Victoria Anderson, guilty. The additional charges followed: conspiracy, theft of pharmaceutical compounds, criminal use of toxic substances. Guilty on all counts. I watched as they were led away in handcuffs, neither of them able to look at me. Victoria's perfect posture was finally broken, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Michael seemed to have aged years in the past few weeks, the weight of his actions visible in every line of his face. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, hungry for details of the sensational case. Mrs. Bennett. How does it feel to know your own family tried to poison you? I faced the cameras, my voice steady. This case wasn't just about poisoning. It was about the corruption of family bonds by jealousy and greed. The real poison was the betrayal of trust. Later that evening, alone in my apartment, I opened my laptop to find an email from the Henderson client. Despite everything that had happened, or perhaps because of it, they were adamant about working exclusively with me. The contract value had increased to $5.2 million. I thought about Victoria's words in the courtroom: "We just needed you to fail, to stop being so perfect at everything." The irony was bitter. Their attempts to destroy me had only made me more vigilant, more determined, more successful. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for next week. The prosecutor had indicated they would seek the maximum penalty, given the premeditated nature of the crimes and the potential lethality of the final poisoning attempt. As I prepared for bed that night, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me wasn't a victim, she was a survivor who had turned her attackers' own schemes against them. But the cost of that victory was the death of everything I'd believed about family and trust. I picked up my phone and deleted all the photos of Michael and me from our happier days. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was mine to shape. And I intended to shape it without the shadow of their betrayal hanging over me. 5 years had passed since the trial. I sat in my corner office, reviewing the quarterly reports when an email notification caught my attention. Victoria was up for parole. My finger hovered over the delete button, but curiosity won out. The timing was ironic. Just yesterday, I'd finalized my plans to acquire Anderson Marketing, Victoria's former company, now struggling after the scandal. The board had practically begged me to take over, hoping my reputation could salvage what was left of their client base. I'd been methodically preparing for this moment. While Victoria and Michael served their sentences, I'd been quietly gathering evidence of their past business irregularities. Each revelation strategically leaked to industry insiders, ensuring their complete professional destruction. Opening my laptop, I pulled up the latest headlines. Former marketing executive denied early release. Bennett Consulting acquires troubled Anderson Marketing. Industry leader expands portfolio with strategic acquisition. The deal would be announced tomorrow. Victoria would learn about it in prison, watching her life's work being absorbed by the very person she had tried to destroy. Sometimes, success truly was the best revenge. My intercom buzzed. "Ms. Bennett, the board members are ready for you." In the boardroom, I faced the former Anderson marketing executives. Many had known about Victoria and Michael's schemes but had chosen to look the other way. Now they sat before me, their futures in my hands. As you know, the acquisition will be finalized tomorrow, I began, my voice steady. There will be significant changes in management structure. Those who demonstrated ethical leadership will find opportunities in our organization. Others may want to explore different options. The message was clear. Those who had enabled Victoria's behavior wouldn't have a place in the new structure. Their nervous glances told me they understood perfectly. After the meeting, I opened another email, this one from Michael's prison account. He still wrote occasionally, claiming remorse, begging forgiveness. Like Victoria's parole notice, this one also went unanswered. That evening, I stood on my office balcony, watching the city lights flicker to life. The company I'd built from the ashes of their betrayal now dominated the market. Every client they had tried to steal was now mine, along with dozens more. My assistant brought in the final acquisition papers. Everything's ready for tomorrow, Ms. Bennett. Will you be attending the parole hearing? I shook my head. I have more important matters to attend to. The next morning, I arrived early to oversee the changing of the building signs. Anderson Marketing's logo was replaced with Bennett Consulting's emblem. By the time Victoria read about it in the prison newspaper, her company would cease to exist. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Martinez, who had become a friend over the years. Thought you'd want to know, both parole applications denied. Board cited lack of genuine remorse. I smiled, typing back a simple thank you. They would serve their full sentences, but the real punishment was watching their carefully built world crumble from behind bars. As I prepared for the press conference announcing the acquisition, I caught my reflection in the window. I wasn't just a survivor anymore, I was a conqueror. Their attempt to destroy me had instead given me the strength and determination to build something far greater than they had ever imagined. The press room was packed when I took the podium. Today marks not just a business acquisition, I began, but a commitment to ethical leadership and professional integrity. The industry has learned hard lessons about the cost of unchecked ambition and moral compromise. Later that day, I received one final email from Victoria's former assistant, Emily. She had attached an article about Victoria's reaction to the acquisition news. Apparently, the announcement had triggered a complete breakdown in the prison's common room. I closed my laptop, gathering my things to leave. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new victories. But for now, I savored the knowledge that justice hadn't just been served, it had been served with perfect, poetic timing. Walking out of the office, I passed the newly installed company sign. Bennett Consulting stood where Anderson Marketing had once been, a daily reminder that sometimes the best revenge isn't just success, but taking everything your enemies held dear and making it your own. The city lights twinkled as I drove home, reflecting on how far I'd come from that morning at Victoria's house, staring at a poisoned coffee cup. They had tried to write my ending, but instead, I had rewritten theirs. And this was just the beginning.